The first call he didn't return was from Martin Ellery. He saw the name on the screen on a Wednesday morning and let it go to voicemail, which he'd never done before in 11 years of knowing Martin, because for 11 years, Martin had been a useful person, and you returned calls from useful people. But he was sitting in his car in the parking garage of a building he no longer had a badge to enter, having just been told by the security desk that his credentials had been deactivated as of Monday, and he was not in a condition to be Martin Ellery's version of himself. He sat in the car for 22 minutes. He'd been senior vice president of operations at a regional logistics company for 7 years. Before that, director. Before that, a series of positions that had formed a clear upward line when you laid them out, which he had occasionally laid out for himself in the specific way of a person who needs to see the line. He'd had a team of 41 people. He'd had a corner office on the 14th floor with a view that included a sliver of the river if you stood at the right angle. He'd had a parking spot with his name on it. The parking spot still had his name on it. He'd noticed that on the way in. Nobody had changed the sign yet. His name on a sign in a parking garage, as evidence of a life. He thought about that for a moment, and then stopped thinking about it. The official language had been restructuring. The company was consolidating regional operations. His division was being absorbed into a national structure. His role was being eliminated. He'd been given 30 days, a severance package that was fair by any legal standard, and a handshake from the CEO who'd promoted him 6 years ago and who had, in that moment, looked at the middle distance slightly to the left of David's head. He drove home. He didn't play the voicemail from Martin. If this kind of story, not a tragedy, just a man and a parking space and the 11 months after, lands somewhere for you, subscribe. We look at real human situations here, the ones that teach you something you didn't want to learn. His name was David Carlisle, and he was 53, and he had spent most of his adult life being, in the ambient sense, important. Not famous, he wasn't confused about the scale of it, but important in the specific regional way of a man whose name appeared in industry publications, whose calls were returned within the hour, who was invited to things and asked to chair things and consulted about things. He'd known the mayor's chief of staff. He'd been on a board. He'd attended the kind of dinners where the room was full of people who were also at the level where they got invited to this kind of dinner. He'd thought of this as evidence of who he was. He understood now, or was beginning to understand, which was different and slower, that he'd been confusing the room with himself. His wife, Laura, had stayed. He noted this because he'd worried, in the first weeks, that the staying was the part that might be complicated. Not because Laura was unkind or shallow, but because they'd built their life inside a particular context, and he wasn't sure what they were outside it. What he found was that Laura was more herself than he'd realized, and that he'd been less present than she'd deserved, and that the reorganization of their days had produced something uncomfortable, but not wrong. She'd been, without making it a speech, available. She'd made coffee and not said much, and let him be where he was. This was its own kind of discovery, and not the one this story is about. His son James was 24 and in Denver, and called more often than before, which David noticed and didn't know what to do with. They'd been close in the abstract way of fathers and sons who get along and don't fight and don't fully see each other. He was starting to see James more clearly. He wasn't sure James had changed or whether David had just been looking. His circle, the room full of people who also got invited to the dinners, was another matter. The disappearing took about 6 weeks. Not all at once, gradually, which was in some ways worse, because gradually allowed him to keep explaining each individual instance in terms that didn't require the larger conclusion. Martin's voicemail he'd ignored because he wasn't ready. Martin called again 2 weeks later. A shorter message said he'd heard the news, said they should catch up. David called back. They had a 15-minute call that was warm in tone and had the specific texture of a conversation between two people who both know something has changed and are being careful around it. Martin said they'd get dinner. David said absolutely. Neither of them suggested a date. There was no dinner. There were 11 similar conversations in the first 3 months. 11 people who expressed warmth and regret and the intention of continued connection, and then did not follow through on that intention. He didn't blame any of them individually. He understood, by the 4th or 5th, the pattern he was in. He called 2 people who didn't call back at all. He called one person, a man named Richard, who'd been a peer for years, who David had helped through a difficult period in 2019 in a way that had been specific and consequential, and left a message that was more personal than he usually got, and received a reply by text the following week that said, "Hey, sorry, been insane. Let's find time." No time was found. He'd sent the text while sitting at his kitchen table in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon with nowhere he needed to be. He put the phone down and looked at the kitchen. He'd been in this kitchen thousands of times and had never, he realized, spent a Wednesday afternoon in it without something requiring his presence elsewhere. The kitchen looked different at 2 in the afternoon in November. The light came through the window at an angle he didn't recognize. He made coffee and sat at the table and thought about Richard's text. He'd helped Richard through a situation that had involved a conversation with a board member, a specific favor, the kind of thing that gets remembered and repaid. He'd thought about that, making the call. He'd thought, Richard owes me. He sat with how that felt. Not great was the answer. Not great to have made the call with that accounting in his head. Not great to be 53 years old and sitting at a kitchen table on a Wednesday afternoon, wondering whether a favor he'd done in 2019 was still in someone's ledger. He poured his coffee and looked out the window. The person who showed up was named Gary Tilson. He lived 2 houses down and had lived there for 8 years, and David had spoken to him, across all those years, in the specific shallow frequency of neighbors who wave and occasionally comment on the weather, and have never once had a conversation of any substance. Gary worked somewhere in logistics, not at David's level, something mid-level. David had never paid enough attention to know the specifics. He had a dog named something David had also never retained. He was pleasant and forgettable in the way that people become forgettable when you have sorted them into a category that doesn't require further attention. He came over on a Saturday morning in December with a bottle of bourbon. Not a great bottle, a solid mid-shelf thing. He knocked on the door, and when David opened it, he held it out and said, "I heard about the job. That's a rough thing." David looked at him. "I don't need," he started. "I'm not giving you a gift," Gary said. "I figured you might want someone to drink with who wasn't going to make it a whole thing." He looked at the bottle and then at David. "If that's not what you want, I'll go away." David stepped back from the door. They sat at the kitchen table. Gary opened the bottle and poured 2 glasses with the practicality of a man who was not performing generosity. He didn't say much. He asked how Laura was. He said his own job had gone sideways a few years ago, and it had taken longer to land than he'd expected. He said it the way you say things when you're not trying to make a point, just as information, as evidence that he was not sitting here as someone who didn't know what the thing felt like. David drank his bourbon and looked at the kitchen table and didn't perform anything. "Were you close with the people at the company?" Gary said. "I thought so," David said. Gary nodded. "That's the part that takes a while," he said, figuring out which part of it was real. He didn't elaborate. He didn't offer a framework for understanding what David was going through. He just sat there on a Saturday morning with his mid-shelf bourbon, not requiring David to be any particular version of himself. David found he didn't know what to do with this. He'd been managed and networked and performed at for so long that sitting in a room where none of that was happening required an adjustment he hadn't made in years. "I don't know you very well," he said. "I know," Gary said. "We've been neighbors for 8 years." "Yeah, that's on me," David said. Gary looked at his glass. It's on both of us, he said. I'm not a great initiator either. A pause. But you looked like someone who could use a drink more than I could use a free Saturday morning. David looked at him. He'd spent 30 years in rooms full of people who were watching him and measuring him and wanting things from him and performing back at him. He was sitting now in his own kitchen with a man he barely knew who had knocked on his door with a bottle of bourbon and no agenda, and was offering, simply and without fanfare, the company of a person who wasn't interested in what David's job title was. Thank you, David said. Sure, Gary said. They drank the bourbon. Gary's dog was named Chester. He mentioned this at some point, and David made a note of it, actually made a note of it, in the way you make notes when you've recently understood that paying attention to small things is something you owe people. He did call Martin again in January. He'd thought about not calling, had gone back and forth on it, had sat with the question of whether the energy required to maintain something that might not be real anymore was energy he had. He'd decided to call because doing nothing felt worse than knowing. Martin was warm. Martin had a lunch slot in February. He'd been meaning to reach out, he said. Things had been crazy. David said February worked. He confirmed the date. He put it in his calendar. Martin canceled 4 days before. His assistant sent the message. She offered to reschedule. David replied that he'd follow up, and did not follow up. He sat with how he felt about that for an evening. Not devastated. That was interesting. A year ago, he'd have been not devastated, but activated, working angles, finding the next move to maintain the relationship. Now he sat with it and felt something simpler. Clarity. Not pleasant clarity, but the useful kind. He called his son that evening. James picked up on the second ring. He always did now, David had noticed, which still surprised him. Hey, Dad? Hey, nothing urgent. I just wanted to call. James said, Okay. He said it without the wariness of someone receiving an unusual thing. He said it the way you say okay when someone calls and you're glad they called. How's it going? David thought about Martin's canceled lunch and Gary's bourbon and the kitchen at 2 p.m. and the parking spot with his name on it. Honestly, he said. Yeah, James said. Honestly. David looked out the window at the December street. I'm figuring out what was real, he said. James was quiet for a moment. That sounds hard, he said. It is, David said. It's also... He stopped, tried to find the word. It's clarifying, I think. I'm not sure yet. I'm glad you called, James said. Me too, David said. They talked for 40 minutes, about James's job and a project he was working on and a trip he was considering. David asked questions and listened to the answers, and at no point did he feel the specific distraction of a man whose attention was somewhere else. He'd been somewhere else for most of his son's adult life. He thought about that after they hung up. He sat with it without making it into a verdict. He was learning, slowly, to sit with things without immediately constructing what they meant about him. Just, I was somewhere else. That was true. James was here now, and so was David, and that was also true. He ran into Richard in February, at the grocery store, the produce section. He saw Richard before Richard saw him and had a 2-second window in which he could have gone to a different aisle. He didn't. He walked over. Richard saw him, and his face did something that David recognized. The recalibration, the selection of a register. He settled on warm but brief. David, how are you? Good, David said. You? Crazy busy. You know how it is. A pause. We really do need to find time to... Richard, David said. Richard looked at him. You don't have to, David said. The ketchup dinner. I know it's not going to happen. He said it without anger. He'd checked before he opened his mouth and found the anger had mostly converted into something else. "That's okay. I just wanted to say that you don't have to keep offering it." Richard was quiet. "I called because I thought you owed me," David said, "for 2019. That was the wrong call for the wrong reason. I'm not saying that to make you feel bad. I'm saying it because it's true, and I think we both knew it." Richard looked at the produce. "I should have called you back," he said. "You should have," David said. "But I understand why you didn't." He meant it. He'd spent the past months with enough time to think about how the room had looked from Richard's side, what calling David back would have required. The energy of navigating a changed situation without the reward of a useful contact. Richard wasn't a bad person. He was a person who organized his time around what it produced. David had done the same thing for 30 years. "I hope things are going well," David said. He walked to a different aisle. He bought his groceries. He drove home. He sat in the car in the driveway for a moment before going inside. He felt something that took him a moment to name. Not pride exactly, not righteousness. Something more specific. He'd told the truth and hadn't required anything from it. That was new. Drop a comment below. Have you ever found yourself on either side of this? The one who disappeared, or the one who was surprised by who stayed? Sometimes it's useful to name which one. We'll be here. He had coffee with Gary on the third Saturday in March. It had become a thing, not formally arranged, just a habit that had grown from 2 instances into a pattern. Gary would knock around 9 or 10 with his dog on a leash, and sometimes they'd sit on the porch, and sometimes they'd come inside, and the conversation went where it went, which was to say it went sideways and covered things without a clear agenda and occasionally landed on something real. Gary had been at his mid-level logistics job for 9 years. He'd interviewed for a senior role twice and not gotten it twice, and had, somewhere in the process, made peace with the specific life he had rather than the one he'd mapped out at 32. He talked about this without resentment, which David found he had to pay attention to because the absence of resentment in that particular sentence seemed like something that required cultivation. "How did you get to that?" David said. "To what?" "To not being angry about the senior roles." Gary scratched Chester's ear. He thought about the question with the genuine consideration of someone who doesn't answer things quickly. "I was angry," he said, "for about a year after the second one. Thought I'd been passed over wrong. Maybe I had been. Probably I had, partially." He paused. "But the anger was eating into stuff I actually valued. Time with my wife, being present for things. I was half somewhere else all the time because I was still having the argument with the people who'd made the call." He looked at David. "And the people who'd made the call had no idea I was having the argument. It was just me and an empty room." David looked at his coffee. An empty room. He thought about the 11 calls in the first 3 months. He thought about sitting at his kitchen table working through a mental accounting of who owed him what. He thought about the version of himself that had existed for 7 years in the corner office, receiving deference and returning calls and attending dinners, and how much of the energy of that version had been going toward the maintenance of the version itself. An empty room. "I think I've been doing a lot of things for an empty room," he said. "Yeah," Gary said. "Most people do for a while." "How do you stop?" Gary looked at Chester. "You start putting your energy somewhere with someone actually in it," he said. "And you notice that the someone actually in it feels different from the empty room. And eventually the empty room stops being interesting." David sat with that. "You're a better person than I gave you credit for," he said. Gary looked at him. "You didn't give me any credit," he said. "You were nice when we ran into each other, and I'm sure you knew my name, but I wasn't on your radar." David didn't argue with this. "No," he said. "That's okay," Gary said. "I probably would have been the same in your position." He finished his coffee. "The thing about losing the position is it makes you available. for different stuff. Available, David said. Yeah. Gary stood and Chester stood with him. You weren't available before. You were... He made a gesture that meant occupied, upward, somewhere else. Now you're here. David watched him go down the porch steps. He got a job offer in April. Not the same level. A director role, smaller company, regional distribution, a straightforward operation without the complexity of what he'd been running. The salary was significantly less. The title was a step down. He sat with the offer for a week. Laura asked him what he was thinking. He told her the honest version, that part of him was still waiting for the other offer, the one that returned him to where he'd been. That part of him was calculating the optics of taking a step down in title. That he'd been on 3 calls about other positions at his previous level, and all 3 had stalled or gone cold. Is the job good? Laura said. It's solid, he said. Good team from what I can see. Straightforward problems. Do you want to do it? He thought about the corner office with the sliver of river view. He thought about the dinners. He thought about Martin's canceled lunch and Richard in the produce section. I don't know, he said. I'm having trouble separating whether I want the job or whether I just want to not be where I am. Laura looked at him. She had, in the past months, been watching him with a quality of attention that was new between them. Not therapeutic, not managing, just seeing him. You've been different, she said. Worse? Different, she said again. More here. More actually present when we're talking. She paused. I don't want you to take a job that turns the clock back on that. He looked at her. 17 years of marriage. A good marriage, he'd always thought. Now he was wondering what good had been obscuring. I've been somewhere else, he said. Partially, she said. Not always, but more than you thought. I'm sorry. She looked at him steadily. I'm not saying that for an apology. I'm saying it so you know what you have here, before you decide what you're rebuilding toward. He sat with that for 3 days. He took the job. The first day was an ordinary day. He'd expected something, some feeling of diminishment that he'd have to manage, some moment of standing in a smaller office thinking about a larger one. What he found was that ordinary was not as bad as he'd been afraid of it. The problems were real, and the team was capable, and the work required him in the way that work requires you when you're actually doing it rather than overseeing the doing. He called Gary that evening. First day, Gary said. First day, David said. How do you know? Laura mentioned it when I ran into her this morning. David absorbed this, the specific ordinary texture of it, his wife talking to a neighbor, a person David now knew, information traveling through a network that was small and actual rather than large and strategic. It was fine, he said. Good, actually. Different. Different how? He thought about how to say it. I knew what everyone's name was by noon, he said. I made a point of it. I went around and introduced myself and asked people about their work. He paused. I didn't do that at my old job. I mean, I knew everyone's name, but I didn't. He stopped. You weren't paying attention the same way, Gary said. No, David said. I wasn't. Chester barked something in the background. You'll be good at it, Gary said. The new thing. How do you know? Because you're paying attention now, Gary said. That's most of it. He ran into 2 people from his old circle in the spring. The first was at an industry event. He'd gone because the new company had sent him, and he'd stood in the room and recognized the architecture of it, the specific hierarchy of attention that rooms like this had. And he'd found he was watching it from the outside in a way he'd never watched it before. He knew people there. A few of them came over, warm enough, and asked what he was up to, and he told them. And he watched their faces do the recalibration they'd done on Richard in the produce section. He felt almost nothing. That was the strange part. He wasn't angry, and he wasn't sad, and he wasn't performing ease. He was just present in the room without being invested in the room, which was something he'd never been before in a room like this. He talked to two people who were genuinely interesting and left early. The second was a former board member named Warren, who he ran into at a coffee shop and who stopped and said his name and looked genuinely glad to see him. Warren was 80, had been retired for 6 years, had the specific settledness of a man who had long ago stopped organizing his life around the rooms that mattered. They stood at the counter and talked for 20 minutes. Warren asked about the new job. David told him. Warren said, "Good. The big jobs look important from the inside, and less so from this distance." He said it without wistfulness, just as information. "Do you miss it?" David said. Warren considered this honestly. "I miss feeling useful," he said. "Not the rest of it. The rest of it turns out to have been quite a lot of noise." He looked at David. "You're young enough to do something about that. I didn't figure it out until I was 67. David said, "I had help." "What kind of help?" David thought about Gary and the mid-shelf bourbon, and Chester and the Saturday mornings, and the empty room and the being available. "The neighbor kind," he said. Warren looked at him. "That's the best kind," he said. He sent Gary a better bottle of bourbon in May. Not as repayment. He'd thought about that and decided the framing mattered. Not repayment, just, "I thought of you when I saw this, and you're someone I think of now, which is the whole point." Gary texted back, "This is too good for a Saturday morning." David texted back, "That's what Saturday evenings are for." Gary texted back a time. They drank it on Gary's porch on a Saturday evening in May, with Chester doing something complicated in the yard, and the neighborhood doing the specific thing neighborhoods do in early summer evenings. The ambient evidence of people living their lives in adjacent spaces. "I've been thinking about something," David said. Gary waited. "About what the last year was for," David said. "Whether there's a way to understand it as, not punishment, but instruction." "What's the instruction?" David looked at the yard. "That I'd built a version of myself that was made of other people's attention," he said. "And I thought it was solid, but it was actually contingent. And when the thing that made people pay attention went away, the version went with it." He paused. "And I had to figure out what was underneath." "What's underneath?" Gary said. David thought about the kitchen on Wednesday afternoons, and Laura watching him from across the table, and James picking up on the second ring, and the woman in the new office whose name he'd learned by noon on the first day. "I don't know the whole shape of it yet," he said, "but it's more actual than what I had before." Gary nodded. "That's the trade," he said. "Actual is less shiny." "Yes," David said, "but it doesn't disappear when your title does." "No," David said, "it doesn't." They sat on the porch in the May evening. Chester came and sat at Gary's feet. The neighborhood continued its ambient business. Somewhere, a block over, someone was cooking something that smelled good, and the smell moved through the air the way smells move in early summer when the windows are open and the evening is taking its time. David drank his bourbon. He was 53 years old, and he had a director title at a smaller company, and a neighbor who knocked on his door with mid-shelf bourbon, and a son who picked up on the second ring, and a wife who was more present than he'd deserved, and a new understanding of a room he'd been performing in for 30 years that was empty. He didn't have the corner office. He had the porch. He sat in it and didn't require it to be anything else. If this story landed somewhere for you, if you recognized the room, or the empty accounting of favors owed, or the person who showed up with no agenda, leave a word in the comments. Sometimes the most honest thing you can say is, "I've been in that room. We'll be here."